Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I'm a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, and a trainer and consultant who works for yoga teachers. This podcast was created for you so that you can connect to the information and inspiration that will help you along the way as a yoga teacher each and every week. I know what it's like to leave a yoga teacher training and feel like you've been dropped off in the jungles of being a yoga teacher and also an entrepreneur. A trend we might be seeing recently is the increased popularity of slower styles of yoga, such as Yin Yoga and Restorative Yoga, which I see people seeking out more and more because they see how it can really help to balance out this very busy, paced, hectic life, and also the stress that we're dealing with. I also hear this question come up from yoga students. What is the difference between Yin Yoga and Restorative Yoga? And sometimes they get mixed up or used interchangeably. Now, there are similarities between them, but there are also so many differences. On today's episode, I am so excited that you get to hear from one of our team members who's also a Yin Yoga expert. Nyk Danu is here to share with us more about these 2 types of yoga. We explore the origins of each of the styles, the intention behind them, as well as some of the differences, including the number and length of poses, counter poses, and the use of props. Nyk also has some really great insights about the internal perspective, physiologically, emotionally, and how each type of yoga impacts the nervous system. This is a great episode if you're thinking about taking a specialized training in either Yin or Restorative Yoga. We have another episode on Restorative Yoga. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Today's episode is also great if you're wondering who each type of yoga is suitable for, or if you just want to deepen your understanding about these 2 practices. All of our show notes with links are ready for you over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/182. There you can see all of the clickable timestamps along with any links that we talk about in today's episode. From there, you can also leave us a review, and I want to give a huge shout out because someone left this review. Their username is That Hope from the United States, and this person said, "This podcast has some of the most interesting topics for yoga teachers and yoga therapists, and those being interviewed truly know their topic. Honest, authentic, and at times vulnerable, this podcast is truly amazing." Thank you so much for your review. It really means a lot that you took the time to do that. And if you haven't as a listener, this is one of the greatest gifts that you can give to a podcaster. I also want to give a shout out of thank you to our sponsor, Schedulicity, who is supporting so many small business owners right now, especially our wellness entrepreneurs, yoga teachers, fitness instructors, with their online scheduling software.
Hello, Connected Yoga Teachers. This is Eric with the Schedulicity Hot Tip of the Week. Some tools for small business entrepreneurs expect you to be ready for everything the second you sign up. But just like improving fitness and flexibility, building a business can take time. If you're ruling the world or just moonlighting on the side, you can select only the options you actually need and use. We also make it easy to schedule personal time. Once your schedule is set up, you can add personal time in just a few clicks to block off lunch breaks, coffee breaks, last-minute errands, or time for self-care. Any break you need, anytime you need it.
Thank you so much, Team Schedulicity. It is such a pleasure to know your company for so long, to use this software myself, and I just absolutely love the customer service that your team offers. Alrighty, let's dive in and meet Nyk. If you are in our Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group, you might have already met Nyk already. She's one of our moderators, and often she's jumping in on discussions to share her insights and valuable resources. But for those of you who maybe don't know her or her work, I want to give you a quick introduction. And also, if you're not in our Facebook group, come on over and join us. There's almost 10,000 yoga teachers from around the world supporting each other in there each and every day. I'll make sure that there's a link to join in our show notes as well. You can always go to the connectedyogateacher.com homepage and there's a join button right there. So as I was saying, if you don't know Nyk already, Nyk is a yin yoga expert and teacher trainer, as well as a yoga therapist who helps with back pain particularly. And you will hear her describe how she likes to work with what she calls quote unquote yoga misfits who don't feel at home in mainstream yoga circles. As a teacher trainer, Nyk offers yin yoga modules as a complement to existing teacher training programs and one-on-one yoga apprenticeships for teachers. She's also currently in the planning stages of an online Yin Yoga Teacher training. We'll make sure that all of the links to Nyk's website and those teacher trainings are in our show notes if you want to go and check them out. She describes herself as a fiercely independent Sagittarius, misfit, introvert, bookworm, cat charmer, crow whisperer, Buddhist, seeker of truth, peaceful warrior, and pro-activist who's not so secretly out to save the world. Let's meet Nyk and hear all about the difference between yin and restorative yoga. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Nyk. It's amazing to have you here today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So for our listeners who don't know you, you are a really important part of our Connected Yoga Teacher team. You're in the Facebook group a lot, supporting our Connected Yoga Teachers in there. But tell us about the other work that you do. What is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
So I've been teaching yoga for 15 years at this point, and I am a yoga therapist. And my niche within yoga therapy is I work mostly with people that have back pain. And even narrower than that, I typically work with what I call yoga misfits. So people who would not normally go to a yoga class for a number of reasons, whether it be they don't feel like they're fit enough or flexible enough, or they think that yoga is just too woo-woo, or so there's a whole bunch of qualities that I would say make up misfits. So that tends to be who I attract, is yoga misfits. And I think that's because prior to me being a yoga teacher, I was a yoga misfit. And so I work a lot with people with back pain, specifically hairdressers and tattoo artists. I do a fair bit of work with them because of their work-related pain. And I'm also a Yin Yoga Teacher trainer. So yoga therapist with back pain specialty and a Yin Yoga Teacher trainer.
Now, I'm really excited that we get to chat today about the difference between Yin yoga and restorative yoga, because this comes up a lot in our Facebook group. It comes up a lot. People are searching online, what's the difference? Or people will use those terms like it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. So tell us, what are the definitions of yin and restorative?
Okay. So first I should say, because of course within the yoga world, there's a buffet of options of everything. I'll first just talk about, when I'm talking about yin yoga, I'm referring to the yin yoga that was codified and taught and made popular by Paul Grilly, my teacher. And I can talk a little bit more about the backstory of that if you're interested. But so that when I say yin yoga, I'm saying like yin yoga with a little G in brackets, as in Paul Grilly, or as his students often call it, the Grilly method. Because I know that there are other yin teachers out there who have started calling what they're doing yin, and it's kind of muddied the waters a little bit. And then when I'm talking about restorative yoga, I'm speaking of restorative in the vein of Judith Lassiter, who is commonly known as the Queen of Restorative. And the reason that I just thought it would be good to define kind of where all of my statements will be coming from is because sometimes also, again, other people have other ideas about what is restorative yoga. So just to know where my framework is coming from. When I'm talking about yin, I'm talking about the yin that was codified by Paul Grilly. And when I'm talking about restorative, I'm talking about in the sort of post-Iyengar and Judith Lassiter tradition, which commonly those two are known as yin and restorative in our yoga world. But there are sort of outliers that, would debate those two. So just to make it clear where my opinions and definitions are coming from.
This is super important because we could look at yin in terms of yin versus yang in terms of yoga. And then I feel like yin would be anything that is, slower paced, down regulating for the nervous system. So that's a really good clarification that that's not what we're looking at today.
And also I think, and this is something that takes time when I do teacher trainings with teachers, is part of understanding yin yoga is having a good understanding of yin-yang theory. Like, what is yin, what is yang, and also understanding that those are not black and white, pun intended, that there is a lot of gray because they are mutually independent and they're a spectrum, not like a fixed destination. So there's no way to look at anything and say, this is 100% yin, this is 100% yang, because it always depends what you're comparing it to, which to the Western brain sounds like I'm being evasive and confusing because we like everything in lists of like opposites and black and white, but it really doesn't work that way. And so one of the things that we go over a lot when I do my teacher trainings is yin yang theory, because once you understand that, it makes it so much easier to understand, how would I lesson plan for this? Especially for teachers that are now doing a lot. There's a lot more now of these classes that they call yin yang, or some people are calling it yang into yin. And when you understand yin yang theory, it makes not only sequencing those classes smooth, but it also makes, it just makes understanding the difference between them and how the transitions need to be. So that might be a whole other podcast, how to sequence a yin yang class.
I was like,
yeah,
I feel like we have to do another podcast on that. That's fascinating.
I would love to.
But if people are wanting to know more, then they can definitely reach out to you before then. You might have to do another blog post. So if we look at yin yoga, designed by Paul Grilly, and restorative, really taught by Judith Hansen Lassiter.
Yes. Yeah.
Want to get her whole last name in there. What are those definitions? How can we see the differences and also the similarities in them?
So I actually did reach out to Judith Lassiter when I was writing a blog post about this, because I thought, rather than me trying to summarize what I think she would define restorative as, I'll just ask the queen herself. And so what she said is, restorative yoga is the use of props to support the body in positions of comfort and ease to facilitate relaxation and health. Restorative yoga is about opening, not about stretching. A few poses might create a slight stretch, but stretching is not the intention at all.
Okay.
So when I look at the biggest difference between the two, it's, again, a matter of degrees and intention. So one of the things that my teacher, Paul Grilly, is really, really big on is intention. Anytime in a yin practice you are adding a pose in, that's the question you're asking yourself. What is the intention of me putting this pose here? And so it's a very intentional practice. And in a yin practice, the intention is to feel some sensation. And now sometimes I'll get a little kickback from teachers on that, worried about people that are hypermobile, and if they're already in their full range of joint motion, should they be feeling sensation? And I want to just be very clear. Please note I said sensation, not stretch.
Right.
So sometimes, and I have experienced this in poses, I'm not going to get a lot of stretch, for example, in yin, what they call sleeping swan anymore in my body, just because genetically I'm predisposed to being fairly open in my hips, and I've been practicing yoga long enough that there's not much left. I'm now, any limits that I have would be due to my bone structure or the fact that I'm laying on the floor. Right. But I can still feel sensation. And this is it's a very subtle switch, and it does take a willingness to really go in, but there's always something happening in every moment. So I might feel the sensation of the earth underneath my body. I might feel the sensation of chi moving through me, a little tingle or a little effervescence or some warmth. Or I might feel the air on my skin, or I might feel restless. So there's always something to feel, even for practitioners that are quite flexible and are no longer going to be getting stretched. So most of the average humans out there are still feeling stretches in their yin poses. But I don't like to say the intention is to feel stretch, because that would then rule out anybody who no longer feels a stretch in that area due to their gifted bone structure or their flexibility or whatever the case may be. Okay. So one of the primary differences between yin and restorative is that in a yin practice, we are trying to feel sensation. In a restorative practice, we're not. In a restorative practice, we're trying to use the props and ample props in such a way that we feel almost as if you're completely supported. You're like you're lying on clouds. There's zero effort. You can just totally let go and you feel held and supported. In a yin pose, you're actually trying to challenge yourself, not in a yang way with movement and repetition and sweat and heat, but the stillness alone can be quite challenging for many of us. The mental aspect of yin is super challenging for like almost everybody. And also patience, that's challenged in yin. So, and you may or may not use props in yin. And that depends on the teacher and the body and the pose. So, you can do a whole yin practice with zero props whatsoever. I happen to love props, so I tend to use them quite a bit. But I think sometimes as yoga teachers, we think as soon as a yoga bolster comes out, it's restorative.
Right.
And that's not the case. A yoga bolster is just a prop, just like a block or a blanket, or that doesn't make a pose restorative. It's the intention behind the pose and what the person is feeling in the pose that would determine, is this yin or is this restorative? Which I realize makes it harder for teachers because that feels subtle. It feels like there's not much of a difference, but there actually is. If you practice both of them in I'm going to say the classical way, like in the Paul Gurley way or in the vein of Judith Lassiter, there's a notable difference. Not only in how the pose feels physically in your body, but also how you feel energetically, mentally afterwards as well. So sometimes people think it's just a matter of degrees, and it is to some extent, but the degrees are actually pretty big. So one example, and I know you'll have pictures available in the show notes for anyone who's not visually going to be able to picture this. One example I'll often use in teacher trainings is I'll get a teacher to lie on just a bolster in what is called, in Canada, commonly heart bed. Sometimes in the States, I hear it called heart bench. So where you just lie on a bolster supporting your spine. So it's going from kind of your lower back all the way up to your head. You're lying down on that with just a bolster. And for most people, when they do that, they're going to feel something in their body. They might feel a little compression in the lower back from being in a little back bend. They might feel the front of their chest opening. They might feel the ribs lifting away from the waist and the expansion of the intercostals. They might even feel the muscles and the fascia of their back body reshaping as it forms itself over the bolster. But for most of the population, there's definitely going to be something they feel there, even though they're lying essentially on a bolster, which could look like, to the untrained eye, a restorative pose.
Right.
But it's not, because what they're feeling is notable. And we're using the bolster in that case as the intention of using it is to make the person come into a back bend. It's sort of like taking a pose like Sphinx and just flipping it upside down.
Right.
Whereas if you were to do heart bed in a restorative way, first of all, you'd likely have two bolsters. You'd have blocks underneath the head of the bolster to prop that up. You'd have blankets underneath your arms so that your arms were lifted high enough that you weren't feeling any sensation of stretch in the chest and the front of the shoulders. You'd have support under your head to lengthen the back of the neck so there was no sensation there. You wouldn't hopefully not be feeling any sensation in the back. So it's essentially, if you were doing a heart bed in a restorative way, it'd be like creating a lazy boy with all of the props. There'd probably be an eye pillow, there'd be a blanket over you. And then the intention there is when you come into that pose is to feel nothing physically, to not feel anything that feels tight, uncomfortable, sore, stretchy, nothing. You should feel in a good restorative practice so supported and held that your body can completely let go and it can become purely a practice of your nervous system, which is the primary intention of restorative yoga.
Oh, this is so good. I just want
the
to
nervous system.
Yeah. I love that you said that that's the primary intention for restorative. Is there a primary intention? So did I hear you right that the primary intention with yin is to feel the sensation?
Yeah. So the primary intentions in yin, I would say physically, would be to feel sensation and to move your body in a functional range of movements. So it's about function. Anytime you're putting a yin pose in a sequence, you have to be asking yourself, what is the function of this pose? Like, why am I putting it here? He's very intentional and very deliberate, which I really appreciate. So, for example, we'll just stick with heart bed since we're on that. So the function of a yin heart bed with just one bolster, for example, would be to feel a little bit of gentle compression in the lower back, which, if you're doing a little gentle compression, the bones actually appreciate that a bit. It's about the same amount of compression you might get in your wrists if you've done plank for a while, where you do get a little bit of that dull ache, but it goes away quickly as soon as you start moving. So that you may feel in your lower back. You might feel the ribs lifting away from the pelvis. You might feel the intercostal stretching, the heart opening, all of the muscles and the deep fascia of the back body also opening. So that's the intention then of a heart bed in yin. And fascia is sort of yin's secret superpower, specifically deep fascia. That's one of its, that's really what makes it special, is that we're in these poses for a long duration of time in stillness so that we do get into the deep fascia and also either gentle traction in the joints or gentle compression in the joints.
One note for our listeners, if they're wondering about fascia, I interviewed Gil Headley about fascia. If you really want to geek out into that,
really want to nerd out, please. Yes, Gil Headley's so awesome. So yes, if people are confused about fascia, that's a great one to go back to. But there are different levels of fascia, and again, that's not the point of this podcast, so we won't get into all of it. But yin is specifically suited for deep fascia.
Okay,
and you'll know when you've reached a state of releasing deep fascia in a yin practice, because when you come out of a shape, you're going to feel this urge to sort of moan and groan and move really slowly. You're going to feel temporarily vulnerable and a little fragile. And then we typically in yin then take a rest, where you're just in either stillness or movement, depending on the practitioner, to notice what my teacher calls the rebound, but I don't love that word. So I use the resonance, or the sometimes called the echo of the pose in your body. And that is unique to yin. There isn't any other style of yoga that I've ever practiced, and I've pretty much done them all, that has that echo or that resonance of the pose afterwards in the body. And that's how we know we've accessed our deep fascia.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So yeah, in restorative, we're trying to feel so held and supported that our body can completely let go, and we can just start to bathe in our parasympathetic nervous system. That is the whole point of that practice, is switching gears from this sort of fight, flight, freeze response that most of us are in far more than we'd like to admit. I mean, even just culturally, we're always being bombarded. And so a restorative practice, that is the whole point. It's all about healing your parasympathetic nervous system and being able to spend a large amount of time in deep rest. Whereas in yin, I would not say that it feeling like a gentle, nourishing practice is actually the intention. And it might be gentler if you're using forms of yang yoga as your guidepost. So yes, we're not going to strengthen our core in yin. Yes, we're not going to get hot and sweaty. We're not going to do plank pose. We're not going to do handstand. So in that sense, I'm doing air quotes here, gentle, but it's anything but easy.
Right.
Sitting for minutes at a time, feeling sensation in your body, often when the teacher is not talking, is not easy. And that's when all the mental stuff comes up, which is another key aspect of yin. A couple of yin's nicknames are the quiet yoga or the meditative yoga. And so we actually do want to give our students enough time to mentally, so enough space between our words, that they actually do get to kind of marinate in their mind stuff and notice all the stuff that comes up. Just like in a meditation practice, you don't realize you have a busy brain until you sit still and focus on nothing. And then it's like, oh my gosh, is my mind always this loud? And so that happens in a yin practice. We come into the pose, we make any adjustments we need to get comfortable, whether that's props or not, to hold for the duration of time. And then you just hang out there. And that's actually really hard. So this is why the word gentle can be a bit off-putting for me, because I don't think sitting there dealing with your brain for minutes at a time is necessarily what you would call a gentle practice.
Right. So are there some students, like if someone came to you and they've never tried yoga before and they're like, what should I try? I've heard of yin, I've heard of restorative. Would you say, okay, well, this type of yoga is good for you if you want this? Or do you ever think okay, yin isn't for the beginner student?
Actually, I don't. And here's why. Because I don't think that experience in yoga determines whether or not somebody has the emotional, mental wherewithal to deal with their mind stuff.
Right.
Right? Like there are practitioners out there who have been doing yoga for decades and are not willing to sit in meditation. And there are people who walk into the studio because they want to meditate. So I don't think you can equate it to yoga experience. I do think that it takes a certain amount of willingness. And that's not always the case with people. So, for example, and I don't know if your podcast is PG-13, so I'm going to not use the word that the person actually said, just in case.
It'll get edited out.
One time I was rolling up into a studio that I teach at, and I was teaching the yin class, and the class that had finished before was a really hot, sweaty, movement class. And there was this really young, strong, kind of Ken doll looking guy who said, "Oh, what class is next?" And I could tell he wanted to do a twofer, like he wanted to double up. And I said, "Oh, it's yin." And he looked at me and he said, "F that." He's like, "I will take a handstand workshop over yin any day. That scares me." And so he's been doing yoga a long time.
Right.
He's adept. He's in handstands. But the quieter, sit with your mind stuff that happens in yin, for him, was a no-go. Meanwhile, you could have somebody walk into a studio and that's the whole reason they're coming, is to do some of this contemplation and this introspection and to spend some time, sort of getting to know themselves. And then in that case, absolutely, yin would be great for them. So I don't think you can say like beginners versus experienced yogis. I think it basically depends on where they're at mentally and emotionally. And that can change over time, especially in cases of trauma, for example. So I don't teach trauma-sensitive yoga as it's defined by the trauma center. I teach what I call trauma-informed yoga. So as a yoga therapist, we all take trauma training. And so I try to make my yin classes as trauma-informed as I can. But just the nature of sitting still for a lot of time in poses with yourself can be too much for people, depending where they are in their trauma journey. So that's one end of the spectrum. And I've also worked privately with clients who specifically sought me out for yin, and we're working privately with yin. And I don't even find out until we start working together that they're dealing with trauma, because it's nothing that they put on their form. They don't mention it to me at all. And they actually are at the point in their trauma journey working with a therapist. I would always recommend, if you're doing yin with anybody who has trauma, that they should also be working with a therapist, and that therapist should know essentially what you're doing. That needs to be a team effort there. So, she's working with a therapist, and she's at the point in her trauma recovery where she is starting to try to strengthen her response. So there's a part where they start to revisit some of the things that maybe would trigger their PTSD. And in the case of her, and I've actually since had a few clients, yin was pivotal because it gave them a safe space with me to go into their body, to feel that trigger rising, and to be able to stay with it in a way that felt safe. And so for them, it was incredibly healing for their trauma. So we can't, again, generalize that, you can't do trauma-informed yoga and do yin either. It really depends on the individual. But overall, whether you've got, PTSD or not, or you've just, everyone has trauma. We've all got trauma.
Yes.
Regardless, culturally, for us as Westerners, it's very hard to sit still and quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when people say, "Oh, yin is gentle," I'm like, well, that depends. Physically, probably, yeah. So it depends on how you're defining gentle. If you're defining gentle as like, am I going to get hot and sweaty and strengthen my core? No, you're definitely not going to get that. You're not going to improve your balance in yin, at least not your physical balance. It's more of a mental, emotional practice, and it happens while you're in these shapes. So essentially the difference is that in meditation, you're just sitting sort of in your seated posture, meditating. And in yin, you're doing the asanas or the shapes. And then, you're focusing on whatever comes up. And different teachers are different. Some have a very meditative approach. Some kind of just leave the space open when they're not talking and they don't address anything that could come up, which I think is kind of unfortunate. And some really guide them with certain meditation techniques and like are very specific with like, here's what we're going to do while we're in our poses. So it really depends on the teacher. But one thing that I have noticed that comes up a lot, and even with teachers that I train when they come to my teacher trainings for Yin, they say things like, I tried Yin once and all I was irritated and impatient. And then all these emotions started coming up and it was horrible. And I'm like, well, yeah. When was the last time you sat still?
Right.
And I'm also asking them, well, did the teacher not address that these things could come up? Because in my classes, I always, at the beginning, when they're lying down, say, if anyone here is new to Yin, put one hand on your belly so that I know. Because if there is someone in the room that's new, you better believe I'm going to talk about the mental aspect of this practice.
Right.
I think it's kind of unfortunate or even almost irresponsible to not address that if someone's never done that.
That's a really good point, because we can't even just count on the description on our website either.
No.
People just kind of glaze over and they're like, yeah, sure, I'll try that thing. I've heard of Yin. I'll give it a go.
Plus, most of the yoga teachers that own studios I know tell me that they want their description of Yin in like 15 words or less. And I'm like, well, of course you're not going to get anything across in that. It's like floor, still, quiet. Like that's all I got with what that is. So I always mention, first of all, the Yin practice guidelines, which I can go over. And then I also mention that this is going to be a challenging practice. Not necessarily in the physical way that you might think, where you're going to get hot and sweaty, but that as we do these poses, you're going to go through all of the things mentally. The thinking, the planning, the list writing, the analyzing, the ruminating, the observing, the criticizing, the itching, the bitching, the twitching, repeat over and over and over. And that's totally normal. And that this happens for everybody. And also that emotions can come up because sometimes we don't let ourselves be still and quiet. And so when we are, stuff can come up.
Do you think it's the same?
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think it's the same in restorative yoga that these things come up? Because we know that it's different.
Yeah. And I would say even most teachers who've taught for a while, even if you think about Shavasana, all of us have seen someone cry in Shavasana. Right? It's because that's the time that they're still in quiet. And so anytime you're still in quiet, emotions can rise to the surface. What I notice in the difference in the emotional landscape with restorative and Yin, and again, I'm generalizing, everyone's going to have their own unique experiences, that often in restorative, I'll see some kind of like gentle flowing tears where people are just, it's almost like they're grateful, it's like that gratitude sadness almost that can come up and release. Whereas in Yin, it can be a bit affronting actually. Like Yin's a little bit like, oh, you didn't know you had some shit to look at? Here it is. Take a look at this now. Whereas in restorative, it's very, it's a lot more gentle. Now, of course, all the same things are going to come up. If somebody's not comfortable being still, if someone has ideas in their mind about being productive and they're not comfortable resting or taking downtime, restorative is going to be even more challenging for them. For that personality type, it's almost better to start with Yin actually, because they still feel like they're doing something in air quotes.
Oh, that is so good to know.
Yeah. I mean, and we all know those students that we see that they're constantly fidgeting and they're like looking around the room to be like, is everyone else still actually doing this? Like, are we still just lying here? So for that personality type, Yin could be a better fit because you're not in the poses as long and they're actually feeling sensations. So in their mind, they're going to feel like they're air quotes doing something.
So when you say they're not in the poses that long, what is the difference if we looked at, and knowing that every teacher is different and every student needs something different, but generally, what do you think the length of time is for a hold in Yin versus restorative?
So I recently, again, checked with the Queen about this. And so in Yin, we generally recommend for a mixed level class, 2 to 5 minutes in a pose. Now, that being said, if someone's an experienced Yin practitioner, they've been doing it for many years, they might stretch past 5 minutes. but we don't generally start there. So a general mixed level drop-in class, we're going to say 2 to 5 minutes. If you're following sort of Judith Lassiter's recommendations with restorative yoga, they don't ever do a pose for less than 15. It's like 15 to 20 minutes, which is why it's so important that you get that student so comfortable. Because if you're going to lie still in something for 15 or 20 minutes or even more, I think she even does some poses for 30 minutes, you really need to make sure that every part of your body is totally supported so that you can really just let go and not be 10 minutes in feeling like you've got some lump under you or you need to move or adjust.
Right.
So it's a noticeable difference in timing.
What about the length of the class then? I'm thinking if we look at the length of the class, we'd know roughly how many poses. Do we kind of have that math?
Yeah. So and again, I checked a video recently with Lizzie Lassiter, so Judith's daughter, where she talked about this. And she talked about in a 60 to 75 minute, 3 poses.
Wow.
For restorative. If you have 90, she's like, maybe 4. That's actually really hard to do. That's a lovely position to be in, but let's acknowledge that not everybody has access to enough props to make the poses that comfortable for their students. So if you have 4 blankets and 2 bolsters and 4 blocks for every student, that's really easy to do. Right. But if you don't have that much, it's hard to get students to hold things that long. But I've been in restorative classes where we've held things that long, and there is something magical that happens in that long duration of time for the nervous system. There's a sense of sort of relaxation that is probably deeper than I've ever felt in any other experience in my life. And so that's kind of what they recommend. Now, in a yin practice, if you've got a 2 to 5 minute, that leaves you a lot of range. You could do most of your poses for 5 minutes and have, fewer poses in your class, or you could do some of them for 2 or 3. So typically speaking, the girlies, and I would agree with them, say that in the smaller areas of the body, we do slightly shorter holds because the fascia is not as dense. So if you were doing something for someone's neck or shoulders or, you wouldn't need necessarily 5 minutes. But when you start to get into the big sturdy areas of the body, like the quads, for example, the thighs, or, the spine, then you tend to go towards longer holds. The hips, again, another example where you can do longer holds. And I will often determine this by who's in the room. And I also take requests. So also how many things are on the request list will determine how long I hold things. But often if I have a group of really experienced yin students, so if when I do that check-in and nobody puts their hand on their belly saying they're new, I usually clarify because that's unusual. But I'll usually say, is actually nobody new to yin, really? And then in that case, I can do longer holds quite comfortably because they're already super familiar with how does yin feel in my body, what's going to come up. If it was like most of the room were people that were new to yin, I might shorten some of the poses, especially the really challenging ones like dragon, which is a lunge. I'm not going to do, more than 2 minutes in a dragon pose if people are brand new.
Okay.
Just because that pose tends to be strong.
Yeah. And how long are your yin classes typically?
I have one that's 75 minutes, but otherwise they're always 90. And I pretty much insist on that. I'm old school. I've been teaching long enough that I remember when all yoga classes were 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I just feel for me, in order to offer what I call my bookends as well. So I do a really solid grounding and centering at the beginning before we even practice, which is probably about 8 minutes long, just with them lying in constructive rest. And the yoga therapist in me is like, that just is non-negotiable to me. It's like, I need to get people grounded and, starting to enter their parasympathetic before I even bring in the practice. And then I also like to, have a small meditation and a good solid shavasana. So in order for me to have both of those and still get any poses done, I really need 90 minutes. Not that it can't be done in shorter times. Typically, I just shorten the length of hold in the poses slightly. So instead of doing a 5 minute, it might be most of the poses are 3 minutes. But really, ideally, 90 minutes for me.
And so then were you saying that there is a guided practice, like vocally the teacher is usually guiding a yin practice, or that's how you teach?
I teach I teach a centering, which I call dropping into center at the beginning, which is guided. And it's essentially guided mindfulness where I actually kind of walk them through the koshas, essentially. I don't call it that, but where I start with sort of the external world. So I start with noticing sounds outside of the space, then inside of the space, then noticing sounds perhaps of your body. I walk them through noticing the feeling of the air on their skin and the feeling of the clothing on their body. Then we go into feeling the earth beneath them in the areas that are connecting to the earth, and then also the areas where there's space between the earth. And then we drop inside and we address the mind and any sensations and any emotions. So I do all of that in constructive rest at the beginning of every class I teach, whether it's a therapeutic class, a yin class. That's just sort of one of my signature things, because I think our world is so dysregulated that I just feel like everybody needs that. And so I start there. And that's not necessarily a yin thing. That's more of a, therapeutic yoga teacher who specializes in yin just adds that in. But I mean, you could argue that constructive rest could be considered a yin pose because you're lying on the floor and you're still and you're quiet.
Right.
So,
and then what about in the poses with yin versus restorative? Do you think there's one practice that has more talking in each pose?
In restorative, and I know that this is actually, I think, the hardest thing about teaching restorative as a teacher, especially if you're new to it, is being okay with shutting up.
Right.
Like just, and so when I first started teaching a lot of yin, that was already a little bit weird because you're used to in an active class. You're like, put your knee here, put your foot here, spread your finger. Like there's so many little details that you're calling out. And in a yin practice, once you've demonstrated the pose and suggested some prop variations, and they're all in the pose, other than directing them to something that could anchor their awareness, you're done there. You're just kind of at that point holding space. I do often because I teach my yin quite meditatively. So I do partway through a pose, especially if I can sense that there's a lot of fidgeting going on mentally in the room. I will say something like, if your mind has wandered away, gently bring it back. And I offer a few different things that they can anchor their mind to, but always leave it open for them to choose something else. So I really do treat my yin practice in quite a meditative way. So I might say partway through a pose, if there's been silence, if your mind's wandered, come back. But other than that, I'm pretty quiet. In a restorative practice, I'm almost silent. It's like I get them into the shape. I really love to include a metta practice or a loving kindness practice with restorative. May I be well, may I be happy. So I may say those words at the very beginning as they're settling in, and then nothing, no talkie, because we are inundated constantly with noise and visual stimuli. And part of being in a restorative practice is being able to draw the senses inward, right? To be able to not have to listen, to not be continually being pulled out again. So the more you talk, the more your student is pulled out of their own experience and into your words and into the room. And the more you can be quiet, the more likely they are to be able to drop into themselves. So I would say there's a huge amount of degrees difference there. And sometimes even in an advanced yin class, if no one's new, I might start pulling out some Chinese medicine theory, and we might talk a little bit about the meridians that are working in that pose before I move into silence. Whereas in restorative, it's very quiet.
Right.
Very quiet.
This is exactly what Andrea Peloso talked to us in a podcast episode quite a long time ago about, okay, let's get into silence. And she addresses that. She even addresses music. So do you use music in your yin? That's like a tongue twister. Do you use music in yin? Do you do that? I know in restorative, different people do different things, but I'm just curious with your yin.
I actually use music in both. But I want to qualify that by saying I don't think you need to. The reason I do is because I teach in very urban studios. And so there's a whole lot of noise going on outside the room, like traffic, sirens, shopping carts being pushed down the street. So there's a lot of things that could pull them out of the container that we're creating for that class. And so I find if I can just put some music on, it almost creates like a container or a little bubble that helps to keep them in the space. That being said, I'm very picky about the music I use in either. And there's degrees again with that. So there's almost never words in any of the music I choose. It's more sort of atmospheric sound or maybe some slight vocal toning, but very, very quiet, very, very chill. Ambient, I guess, is probably the best word, is what I tend to use. I don't use things with lyrics because that, again, especially if they understand the words to a song, they're going to be pulled out. They're going to be deciding, do I like the song? Do I not? I know the words of the song now. I'm singing along in my head, and like it can just go, it just pulls them out of their experience again. That being said, in environments where I have the external quiet, I don't really feel like I need to necessarily use the music. I often do because I've just always done it, but I really don't think that it's necessary in either style of yoga. That being said, it's interesting because a lot of, especially like restorative Puritans would say no music. But I have had students actually tell me that they preferred my restorative classes because there was music.
That's really interesting. I mean, there has to be it's such a variation, exactly that teachers prefer something different and students prefer something different. And this is the great thing that, students were drawn to your class because it had music, where other people would be like, no, going to that one because it's silent. That's fascinating.
And usually what I do in a restorative class is I kind of have the music going as they enter, and slowly over the course of the class, even though they probably don't notice it because I'm a little sneaky this way, the music gets turned down more and more and more and more so that eventually they are in silence. But it's like a gradual, it's just like if someone is just rushed to get to the studio and now you ask them to lie on their back and drop into center and pay attention to their breath right away. When you haven't addressed like the external environment, it's not very effective.
Right.
Whereas if you can talk about like, okay, we're all here. Can we hear the sounds? Can we feel these things? And then slowly drop them in, it's far more effective. And so I feel like music for me in a restorative practice is just a tool to do that. It's like they arrive and they hear it and they're like, okay, here it is. It's yoga time.
Right.
It's like what is it? Pablo's bell.
Yeah, that's
like,
what I was just thinking.
Yeah. They hear the music and they're like, okay, here we are. We're at the studio.
My cat hears the tea kettle and he's just like, okay, it's time to get some food.
Oh, hilarious. So the music's that for me in a restorative practice. It's okay, we've arrived, here we are, relaxation time. And then I slowly turn it down pose by pose so that by the end they're in silence.
This is amazing.
In Yin, I keep it generally most of the time, except for meditation and Shavasana. But again, it's still super ambient, very, like if anyone leaves other than yoga teachers, because we're always listening for new music ideas, but if anyone ever leaves my class and is like, what playlist were you using? Then I think I've done my job poorly.
Right.
Because the music should be almost so background that it doesn't really stand out to them other than to create that container. Now, of course, when yoga teachers are in my class, it's different because our brains are always, analyzing everything and like, ooh, that was a great song. I'd like to use that, so that happens. But I've never have students coming up after and saying, what was that track you were playing in, and they shouldn't. It shouldn't stand out. It should just be a way to create the container.
Oh, that is fascinating. Thank you for answering that. That was lots of good information.
Oh, you're welcome. And I know it's a hotly debated. If you want to get people riled up, go into any yoga teacher group on Facebook and put, should we use music in class or not? And then walk away.
How can people work with you if they want to take a yin training or work with you in any way? What's the best way to find you?
So my website is the best place, which is nykdanu.com/teachers. Then that brings you to my teachers portal of my website. And then from there, there's a couple of buttons because I also do business consulting for yoga teachers. So from there, you'll have two choices, business consulting or a yin teacher training. You click on a button and it directs you to where you need to be. You're welcome to click on both if you want. And that's generally getting on my email list is probably the best way for people to find out about what trainings I'm offering. And I'll often just share tidbits of things that I've found interesting through my Yin community, articles or things like that as well. So the best way to work with me in a Yin training capacity is just to jump on that email list. You can also find me on Instagram. I'm just Nyk Danu Yoga. I'm on there. But yeah, I do have 2 separate sections on my website. If you were to just go to nykdanu.com, you would immediately see a page that says teachers, students. So you can just click from there into the teachers section. And that would probably be the best way.
Perfect. That's amazing. Thank you so much for all of this information today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I've learned a lot, and I feel like I get to talk to you every week, but we've never talked this in depth about teaching. So it's really fun. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Connected Yoga Teachers, I wanted to share one more snippet that Nyk and I were talking about. This often happens when I press pause on the recording. We'll get into a good conversation. And so I just wanted to share this one little audio clip with you. Connected Yoga Teachers, Nyk and I just got talking about her email list and how that works. And there's actually a gift that she has for all of you. So Nyk, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a head to toe Yin practice. It's a PDF that you get. So when you sign up for my email list, you get that practice. A lot of times people think that Yin is sort of just from the waist down. And this is basically from the neck all the way to the toes. It's like a full practice. So you would get that PDF and then you'd get any other resources that I send out as they come out.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, Connected Yoga Teachers, I would love to hear your key takeaways for today's episode. If you want to head on over to the show notes at theconnectedyogateacher.com/182, you can comment there and Nyk will check in with that. I will check in with that. And it's just great to hear your thoughts. Maybe you have other resources to share around restorative versus yin yoga, questions after today's episode, or things that you are going to use in your own yoga practice or business. Thank you again, Nyk, for everything that you do as a moderator for our team and also for the work that you're doing in BC, Canada, and online. Thank you also to the rest of our team members, Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead, for making today's episode possible. Thank you also, dear listener. It means so much that you have taken the time today to tune in, to learn a little bit, to hear someone's perspective on different styles of yoga. And as usual, before I sign off, I want to ask you, what will you be doing to stay connected this week? To yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up.